Thank you all for coming today to our webinar and joining us this afternoon. We're going to be talking about incidental disturbances, assessments, and site-specific variances. So this will be pertaining to asbestos containing materials in New York State and how we handle different scenarios where we might have a disturbance of those materials, and then the variance process that we work with the New York State Department of Labor to address those types of situations. Lindsay went over some of these housekeeping and ground rules. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat section of this webinar. We will address those all at the end as we finish up. And then and just with the questions, we will have those questions throughout the presentation. So be aware of those, and when they come up, please submit your answers on those. All right, so just start out, we'll talk a little bit about asbestos containing materials, asbestos building materials. When we're dealing with these, what are we talking about? I mean, we all have probably heard about asbestos commercials routinely about asbestos containing diseases and exposure and repercussions with that. So we know it's out there, it's an issue, it's a concern. But to take a step back and look at it as far as, you know, how we deal with these, you know, in an appropriate manner. Ideally, you want to make sure these things are kept under wraps. You know, you've got materials that are intact, in place. They're not disturbed. They're not harming anyone. Or if you need to disturb them, you need to remove them. That everything is done properly. You have a appropriate containment system. Nobody's going to be exposed to those fibers. You have workers that are dealing with them that have the appropriate personal protective equipment and they're experienced and know how to do that, and also are certified to do that. So if we do everything correctly, ideally, nobody's going to have an exposure to these asbestos fibers that will end up in a disease that you know, unfortunately, once you get to that point, it's a difficult thing because you really can't cure those diseases. So we want to try to avoid that, and we do that by the regulations and everything that we have in place, and doing things with certified personnel and appropriate management procedures. So with categories of asbestos building materials, to start out with, asbestos, it's a naturally occurring mineral. You're going to mine it from the earth. There's different mines throughout the world that have historically mined this material as a component to add to building materials, to make building materials a little bit better as far as heat resistance, fire resistance, durability. It was a very useful mineral in those capabilities. So, you know, they had a lot of uses for it. As far as we're concerned, regulation-wise, and what asbestos is defined as, it is any naturally occurring hydrated mineral silicate separable into commercially usable fibers. And there are mainly the main fibers that are identified that are regulated are chrysotile, amosite, crucidolite, tremolite, anthophyllite, and actinolite. You know, these are the ones that, when the regulations were put in place, were known to be an asbestos fiber. They met the criteria of the length versus diameter ratio, the size of the particle of the fiber. So they were the items that were regulated. Now, there are some other fibers, since we've enacted those regulations, that are pretty similar to these other ones as well. You know, that aren't in the regulations just because it's after the fact. They've done more research, and they just, you know, really never revise regulations to kind of group those in there. So, you know, it is important to know that these are the ones that are regulated. But when you're dealing with any type of fiber, mineral, dust, particulate situation, just be cautious and aware that, you know, anything that you're breathing in that you're not meant to breathe in could be harmful. So, you know, take a step back, look at what you're doing, and try to alleviate those airborne fibers from getting into your lungs and respiratory system. Now, when we're talking about asbestos containing materials, so we take the asbestos, it was put into materials, your building materials, brake systems on vehicles, a lot of different water pipes, sewer pipes, a lot of different uses. So when it's put into a material like that, we define an asbestos containing material as any material that would contain greater than 1% of asbestos by weight. So if you've got a floor tile and you analyze that, and it's got 0.5% asbestos, it's not a regulated asbestos containing material because it's less than 1%. But when you get up in the 1.5, 2, 3 or more percent, then it is regulated as asbestos containing material. So when we're dealing with abating a building of asbestos containing materials, you're talking about the ones that have greater than 1% of asbestos. Now, there is a differentiation between what we call friable versus non-friable asbestos containing materials. And that simply is a friable material is something that you could take in your hand and you could crush it, you could pulverize it, and you're going to release fibers. Very dangerous type of material. So your insulations, some of your spray applied fireproofing, some other surfacing materials, you can imagine you could take those and you could just crumble them pretty easily, and those fibers are going to be released to the air. So those are obviously the more dangerous types because you have that quicker exposure risk, higher risk of exposure to those airborne fibers. Whereas a non-friable material, you're talking about your floor tiles, your adhesives, your mastics, you're not going to generally be able to take those in your hand and just crush them and pulverize them to release those fibers. They're going to be a little bit more bound, a little less dangerous, but still, if you're talking about demolition activities where you're taking a hammer, sledgehammer, mechanical devices, cutting things, yeah, you're going to release those fibers. So even a non-friable material, if it handled improperly, is going to release asbestos fibers and would be a danger for exposure. EPA has some classifications. They have thermal system insulation, surfacing, and miscellaneous. And basically, you got your thermal system insulation, which is anything that keeps hot things hot, cold things cold. So your pipe insulation, your boiler system breaching materials, anything like that. That's your thermal system insulation category. Surfacing, anything that you would apply, troweled on, applied to the surface as a coating. Some plaster, wall systems might have a surface coat on it, which would be a surfacing material. Spray applied fireproof and surfacing. And then the larger category, miscellaneous, this has become a much larger category than the other two, would be everything else. So your floor tiles, your ceiling tiles, gypsum board, plaster, those types of materials will all be under miscellaneous. So when they came out with the regulations, it was important for distinguishing these because generally those TSIs and even the surfacing were more of your friable materials were the more dangerous ones, would have a little bit more restrictions to them than your miscellaneous. But here in New York State, we don't put a lot of emphasis on whether it's TSI, surfacing, or miscellaneous. We kind of treat them all the same. We want to abate them properly. We want to make sure certified workers are dealing with these, and it's not the general public being exposed to it inadvertently. So New York State, we have a set of regulations that pretty much cover any type of asbestos material you have. They're pretty similar in the way they handle them. Some other things you might hear of out there in the asbestos world: ACM, PACM, RACM. So ACM, again, is the asbestos containing material, anything greater than 1% of asbestos. But then you have PACM, which is presumed ACM. So it's a material that may not have been tested and determined and known to be asbestos containing material, but it's of a certain vintage, and it's a suspect asbestos containing material that we call it presumed. So without testing, we're still presuming it is asbestos containing material, and you still should be dealing with it as if it contained asbestos until you do some sample analysis to show otherwise. And then the RACM is your regulated asbestos containing materials, and this has to do with primarily disposal type considerations. When you do an abatement project and you generate regulated ACM, so your friable regulated waste, that has to be disposed of at specific landfill facilities that are permitted to accept that type of material. So when you deal with the non-friables, a lot of times that ends up being regular construction demolition debris. It's asbestos, but more landfills can accept that type of material than when you get into that RACM category. So what are the rules and regulations? There are federal regulations that we abide by in the asbestos world, and there's also state regulations. So on the federal side, the three primary regulations are HERA, NESHAPS, and OSHA. Starting with HERA, that's the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act, and this deals with K through 12 schools. So again, going back to the origins of when asbestos became a real big concern and was known to be an issue, known to cause some significant side effects, the big thing was there's a latency period with these exposure to asbestos materials. So someone who had been exposed to it, say today, they have a latency period probably 15, 30 years generally, maybe out to 45 years. So there's more of a concern with younger people, kids 6, 7, 8, 10 years old. If they're exposed to asbestos, they may not show signs till about 15, 20 years later, but that still only puts them at 30s and 40s. So you can see it's a much greater concern for someone in the younger population. So AHERA was targeted at protecting that group of individuals, those younger students, K through 12. And there's a lot of emphasis put on what we do at schools and how we manage asbestos materials in schools. The other things that on the federal level, the NESHAPs, National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants. So that covers everything with asbestos requirements, from how you set up a work area, containment, how you make sure you don't have any dust particulates and fibers being released from a work area for abatement, how you do surveys, all that stuff. So that covers pretty much everything, where AHERA is K through 12, NESHAPs is everything. And then OSHA goes into more worker protection. So how does an employer protect their employees when they're working in and around asbestos materials? So there's requirements, for the people that are actually certified to do the work and how they go about their business, but also, even if you don't have certified abatement workers, they need to know, if there's asbestos materials in the areas that they work, and if they might have a possibility to disturb them, they should have some awareness training on that. Now, on the state level here in New York State, we are fortunate we do have our own program for asbestos and how we manage that. So the New York State Department of Labor heads that up, and it's referred to as ICR 56, or Industrial Code Rule 56, Part 12 of the New York State, Part 12 NYCCRR, Part 56. So if you're interested, you can go look that up. A document there, you'll find there's the cover of it, and that lays out the state parameters of how we manage asbestos here in New York. It does accommodate all the federal requirements, and then there's some additional stuff on top of that. So if you follow New York State DOL Code Rule 56, you're also generally you're going to be in compliance with all of the federal regulations as well. Now, the DEC does have some things concerning asbestos, but they're more for asbestos-related spills. So if you have a pound or more of asbestos that is released, it is generally a reportable incident, reportable spill incident, and the DEC would have jurisdiction over that. But for the most part, when we're dealing with asbestos, we're talking about building materials inside a building. And if things are done correctly, you're not going to have these spills to the environment. You're going to have things that are managed inside a building, removed from a building, contained, disposed of properly, and you'll be in good shape. So most of the time, the DEC doesn't get involved with asbestos-related items. And then you also, on the state level, you have the Public Employee Safety and Health, which has similar requirements, criteria as OSHA, but will help to protect the public employees of the state of New York. So we'll talk a little about sampling. So this will come into play later on in our discussion here today when we talk about how we do incidental disturbance assessments. But there are some different types of samples just to be aware of. To start out with, there's bulk samples, and as you can imagine, this is going and taking a piece of the material itself. So you would go and like a sealant tile here, or even insulation, the paper backing on that insulation there, we would collect a bulk sample right from there, floor tile, anything like that. You collect a representative piece of that material, send it into the laboratory, and they will analyze that portion of the material for asbestos. And then that'll determine, okay, is this material got asbestos or not? And when you're dealing with bulk samples, you're taking a minimum of 2 per state federal requirements. You may take more depending on the quantity of material you have in a building, or the type of material you have. When you're talking about TSI, surfacing materials, you're going to take more than you would for miscellaneous materials. So that kind of drives how many samples you're going to collect on the bulk side. There's static air samples, and static meaning you set your air sample up in a specific location and it stays in that location throughout the duration of the sampling period. So if you're sampling for a 6-hour duration or a 4-hour duration or 8-hour duration, that sampling pump stays right there. You have the cassette, as you see in the photo there, the cassette at the end. That stays right with the sampling tube. You pull air through that cassette using that pump system, and they'll take that cassette, return it to the laboratory, and there's a filter inside that cassette where the air flows through. They'll take that filter, put that under the microscope, and that's what they analyze for the asbestos fibers there. There's also personal air samples, very similar to your static air samples, similar, same cassettes and such that you're using. You might use a little different pump because you're wanting to collect it on an employee or on a worker. So you want a pump that they can wear around, and it's not going to be carrying around one of those other pumps that you see up top. So something they can hook on their belt loop, they can walk around with it, and that'll take an air sample as they're doing their work shift. So whatever work activity they're doing, as they're doing it, they've got that cassette on, and it'll give a general representation of what they're breathing in during their work activities. And another type of sample that's out there that's a little less common, a little more rare these days is a micro vacuum sample. This is typically done if you don't really have bulk sample or debris samples, but you're trying to get an evaluation of, if there might be some dust in the area that could have asbestos or asbestos fibers in it. So you would do similar cassette as you do for your air samples. You hook it up to a similar pump system as well. You pull air through that by doing just as it stays a vacuum, a micro vacuum. So you vacuum a certain size area. Whatever collects on that filter media gets sent to the laboratory. They'll analyze it on a microscope, see if you have any asbestos fibers in that micro vacuum dust sample. The problem with those micro vacuums is all the regulations, all the criteria we have out there are for bulk samples and air samples. So we've got standards that are set as far as your bulk samples and air samples, but there's really no standards on your micro vacuum samples. So if you get an asbestos fiber in your micro vacuum samples, it really doesn't matter how many you have. Once you get a positive result, you got to treat it as you got an asbestos containing material issue there. All right, that brings us to question number 1.
Back to you, Cheyenne.
All right, so question number 1 was, what is asbestos containing material? If you picked answer B, any material that contains greater than 1% asbestos, you would be correct. All right, so let's move into incidental disturbances. We've gone through a little bit of the background of asbestos. We got an understanding on what asbestos containing material is, what asbestos fibers are and do, and how we sample those. So what is an incidental disturbance? If you look at New York State DOL Code Rule 56, you go back to that regulation, definition there would tell you an incidental disturbance is the unintentional disturbance of ACM, PACM, or asbestos material. Doesn't matter how it occurred or where it occurred or when it occurred. If it's in a disturbed condition and it's not part of an abatement project, it's not being done, it isn't being disturbed because we're removing it as part of an abatement project, then we're going to consider that an incidental disturbance condition. Now, as far as who's responsible for the cleanup of those, generally it falls back to the owner of that building. They own the building, they own the materials inside the building. It's all there, it's all in their purview. So the owner is ultimately responsible for getting that cleaned up and addressed so that occupants of their building are not exposed to it. Now, they may obviously divert those responsibilities to someone that they hire as a contractor or consultant that knows more of the process and procedures to address that, but still it's ultimately going to be in their hands to get that taken care of. So how do we get these incidental disturbances? There are a lot of common occurrences and some not so common, but first off, you can imagine demolition renovation activities. You got that high risk, you have that high potential that you may have, you're gonna have materials that are disturbed, whether or not they're ACM, that's the question. Okay, so if you do a survey before you do demolition renovation, which is required in New York State, ideally everything's identified. We know what's asbestos, we abate that, we get it out of the way, and then we can demo the rest of the building and not have a concern. Now, that's the ideal world. In actuality, things happen a little differently sometimes. There are instances where you do a full survey, but there's some random material that was placed somewhere and it wasn't observed, it wasn't identified, it was behind a wall system, above a ceiling system, and you encounter it during demolition renovation. Generally, most contractors, if they're in this line of work, especially in the commercial, industrial type settings or school settings, they would be aware that, okay, if we see something that wasn't surveyed prior to the work, and we encounter that while we're doing the work, let's pull back, let's stop, let's have someone assess that and see if it is a material. Hopefully that's done if it is asbestos material, hopefully that's done before it's disturbed. But if it's not, it might become an incidental disturbance condition there. There are other situations where surveys aren't done before a project is performed. A code enforcement official might come check on a site and see that, hey, where's your survey for this? And you don't have one. Well, anything that was disturbed in a suspect asbestos material now needs to be assessed. Is it indeed asbestos material? And do we have an incidental disturbance in that condition going forward? So demolition renovation activities would be a high risk for a disturbance of ACM. Then some other common occurrences, historical unknown. You just, you show up, you do a survey, or you're in a crawl space or an attic area, and lo and behold, you got some debris. You test it, and it's asbestos material. It happens quite frequently. Those areas that you don't normally have people, it's not normally occupied. You don't have people going in and out there routinely. High risk there for disturbance of materials if they're present. Age deterioration, things are going to wear out. You have leaks and such in buildings, water pipe leaks. They're going to damage that insulation that's on those pipes. So, that deterioration can lead to a disturbance or debris from an asbestos material pretty easily. Vibrations, pipe system. If you're working on the third or second floor, cutting a plumbing pipe, what's going on in the basement to that plumbing pipe? Is it moving around? Is it being shaken, vibrations? You could have disturbance that way. And some other common ones would be just basic facility operations, maintenance, custodial activities. If you're in an industry where you're running forklifts or other heavy equipment, you might inadvertently disturb this material back into some pipe insulation. You create a disturbance that way, or just general maintenance, custodial duties. And that's why you'll see a lot of entities that have custodial staff or maintenance staff, that they would have them get some sort of awareness training with asbestos materials. Okay, 2 hours once a year, just to know, okay, we do have asbestos materials in the building. These are where they're at, that we know. These are unknown materials, but be cautious when you're working around them. Don't do anything to disturb them. If you have an activity that might disturb them, bring that to someone's attention so it can be assessed, addressed, and abated beforehand. And then you've got the category that we don't have a lot of control over. People can't really control these types of things. Flood, fire situation. They're obviously going to wreak havoc on a building and all the materials in it that the water or fire comes in contact with, and that's going to create an incidental disturbance most of the time. You might have vandalism. People breaking into a building, stealing copper pipes, or just trashing the place for fun. A lot of times when they do that, you don't have someone speaking up and saying, "Hey, let's be easy on the asbestos materials here, because we don't want a disturbance." No, they're gonna go through and destroy everything. So not a lot of control over that, but it is an incidental disturbance that would have to be addressed. And then animals and wildlife. We've had situations where you might have mice or squirrels or other rodents. They'll chew through materials. If that's an ACM, they don't have the know-how to say, that's ACM, I won't chew through that. So you're going to have those situations with animals and wildlife, or birds may come in, get in a building. And if you ever seen a bird inside a building, they're trying to get out and they're hitting every wall and everything in there. And that could create a disturbance as well. So some things you might not have control over, but still, at the end of the day, if it's disturbed material, it would be an incidental disturbance. So who do we notify when we have these incidental disturbances? Obviously, as the person responsible, as the owner is responsible for the condition of ACM in their buildings and addressing incidental disturbances, they need to be in the know. And then whether they delegate that to a contractor or consultant of their choice, that's their choice, but they should be in the know that they have that condition in their building. Other trades that are in the work area. So if it is construction renovation project, if you have mechanical contractor, plumbing contractor, the general, anybody who's not the abatement contractor, they should still know as well, so they can avoid those areas where the disturbance is, do their work elsewhere until everything is addressed in that incidental disturbance area. And then also a requirement from the Code Rule 56 would be to identify this, notify the incidental disturbances to the local representative of the DOL. And this would be the Asbestos Control Bureau. So they have different asbestos control bureaus throughout the state: Syracuse, Albany, New York City, Buffalo regions. So depending on the region you're in, you would contact that local office and let them know you have an incidental disturbance that you're addressing, and getting cleaned up before, if there's any further exposure. So then once you have it identified and notified, or concurrently with notification, you're going to want to isolate that area immediately as soon as possible so we can prevent people from going in there. And how this is done, this can be done by a barrier. Sometimes it's in a room where there's a door that you can lock. Okay, let's shut the door, lock it up, put a sign on there, nobody's going to enter it. Sometimes you don't have that luxury, so you might have to put some poly barriers up with signage to say, okay, keep out. Other times you might be able to just basically on the picture in the bottom there, put up some asbestos barrier to. So if you're in a facility like an industrial site where people have been trained, people know, if you have an asbestos material area, if we stay out of that, that might suffice. But if you're dealing with a facility where you've got the general public coming in for business, or you have children or kids, you can't rely on something like that. You're going to have to get some sort of permanent barrier to keep people out of there, and keep the owner's liabilities at bay there for that. So how's this done? Typically, you're going to want a licensed abatement contractor doing this. Now, if not everyone has that licensed abatement contractor, on speed dial. So if it's as simple as shutting the door and locking it to start, okay, get that done, and then have the abatement contractor jump on board, put some signs up for you, and then gear up to get everything cleaned up and set up a full abatement work area. Once we have it notified, sealed, isolated, okay, we've got to go in there, we've got to do the incidental disturbance assessment so we know, okay, what's the area of impact, what do we have to clean up, how are we going to go about abating this. So first step is to do a visual assessment. Where's the debris? We have a pipe insulation that got disturbed. What's the extent of the debris field? Where can we visibly see pieces of this material? So we're going to identify that. And this has to be done by a New York State DOL certified building inspector. They're the only ones who can identify the extent of asbestos materials, the quantity and location of materials in a building. And they're going to also, during this process, we'll establish a sampling pan, because we're going to want to look at, okay, this is what we can see, but asbestos fibers, they're small, they get breathed in, we don't see them at all. So we're not just limited to what we can see, we got to kind of assess what we can't see. So how do we go about doing that? We're going to look at debris samples around the area. So dust, if we can get dust type samples around the area that's not the material itself, but it's dust in the area that's settled out, we're going to collect those. And we're going to do that at certain distances away from the visual area of concern. So whether it's 3 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet, 5, 10, 15, something that makes sense relative to the size of the work area and the quantity of material that was impacted. How far did it fall? Something fell 50 feet, we're probably going to want to spread out that sampling further extent than something that fell 1 foot. So that's all going to be developed by the bulk inspector as far as their sampling plan to collect debris samples. All these samples are going to be sent to a lab that does have New York State Environmental Laboratory Approval Program certification to do asbestos analysis. So anything in New York State, we do have to have a New York State DOH approved laboratory doing that analysis. In lieu of the bulk sampling, we can do the microvac sampling, similar process. We're going to select locations away from the debris field, 3, 5, 10 feet, or whatever distance is deemed appropriate. Do those microvacuum samples and sample horizontal surfaces away from the debris field, because that's where your fibers generally are going to settle on those horizontal surfaces. We're also going to do static air samples. Code Rule 56 for large projects, for clearance criteria, they specify 5 samples inside work area, 5 samples outside work area. So a lot of times when we do incidental disturbance assessments, we're mimicking what's required for a large size project. Even if it's ends up being a smaller minor, if we do a large size criteria, that's more restrictive, more stringent criteria that we follow. So we're going to do 5 areas inside the area of concern, 5 areas outside the area of concern. We may adjust those quantities to do more if it's a larger area or there's multiple directions that these fibers may have gone to. So we could increase that, but that would be the general rule of thumb that we would go with, would be 5 in and 5 out. And all these analysis we're going to do by what they call a TEM analysis, and that's transmission electron microscopy. The benefit of a TEM analysis is it will differentiate different types of fibers. So when they do the analysis and they give you a result, they're asbestos fibers. They're not going to be cotton fibers from your shirt. They're not going to be silica fibers or other dust fibers. They're going to be asbestos. So we can compare them directly to requirements for TEM type of analysis. There is another method called PCM, phase contrast microscopy, but the difference there is it gives you all fibers. So you might get a high reading on your air sample. Is it all asbestos? We don't know. It can't differentiate. So we have to get that TEM analysis to make sure we're looking at asbestos only. All right, that brings us to question number 2.
Back to you, Cheyenne.
All right, so question number 2, who performs the visual assessment to identify the extent of debris from an incidental disturbance? The answer there is C, a New York State DOL certified building inspector would be required to do that. All right, so here's just a quick, pictorial on the incidental disturbance assessment process. So if we go into a building, we have a disturbance of exposed pipe. So this represents the exposed pipe that had a disturbance. Our building inspector comes in, sees a debris field here. This is the general area of the debris field. So that's where we're focusing samples out, from around that debris field. So we come in, we'll do some samples, immediately, in a close distance around it, and then, venture outwards, radially outwards to get some additional samples on hold, depending on whether those initial samples come back with asbestos or not. And then we do our air samples. So we're generally going to include 5 that we would call inside the area of concern, then 5 outside the area of concern. Send the initial labs to analysis. Everything comes back good on the air samples. We get two debris samples that were negative, so no asbestos there, but we get 2 that are positive. Then we'll go forward and tell the lab, okay, let's do these 2 samples outside of it. And those both come back negative. Now we are able to define our limits of disturbance, and this would be the area that we would have to clean up. So we put a containment around that area, or maybe, if you have some permanent fixed walls, maybe you just contain the whole area out to the walls, make it a little easier, just clean up that entire area. So you can always extend it once you have the assessment. Okay, we can make it bigger, but we can't make it smaller, because if we made it smaller, then we're missing some of the asbestos to be cleaned up. So we get that incidental disturbance assessment done. Now we have to go to DOL and we have to say, okay, if we're greater than minor size incidental disturbance, because DOL Code Rule 56, they'll allow you to do a cleanup of a minor size per the requirements of those regulations. But if we're talking about a small size or a large size project, we're getting into where we have to submit a site specific variance. And so that's applicable to any firm, subject to Code Rule 56. They may petition the Department of Labor for a site specific variance from limited provisions of the Code Rule on grounds that there are practical difficulties or unnecessary hardship in carrying out those provisions. So it doesn't only apply to, you know, these incidental disturbance assessment condition type scenarios, but if you have another type of hardship, you can also submit for a site specific variance to get some relief from Code Rule 56 requirements. There are emergency, non-emergency situations. And, you know, I mean, these are emergency relative to health and safety of people, not emergencies because a construction project might get held up. DL doesn't consider that an emergency. If it's an emergency, it's something in an area where people are routinely accessing or need access to, or you know, the surrounding areas might be impacted if we don't get this addressed. It's not, you know, going down in a crawl space and finding debris there that's probably been there for 15 years. That would be a non-emergency. So you got to be cognizant of what would qualify as non-emergency versus emergency. So a site-specific variance petition process generally involves, you're going to involve a certified asbestos designer. So there's a New York State DOL certification for an asbestos designer who would prepare, you know, those site-specific variance petitions. They do have to be signed off by a designer, so it is a requirement to have that certification to submit a petition for a variance. They would submit that by or on behalf of the owner. So the owner can submit it themselves, or they can have that certified asbestos designer just handle it and submit it on their behalf, which is typically a process. But you're always identifying who the owner is on the petition anyhow. And then it goes to the New York State Department of Labor. In the unit that reviews all variances is the Engineering Services Unit out of Albany. So it's a little different than their asbestos control bureaus that are regional. They have one centralized Engineering Services Unit there in Albany, and they do all the reviews of any variance that is submitted. So for incidental disturbances, as I mentioned earlier, minor, you don't need that variance, so anything less than 10 square feet. But when you get into a small or large, and you can see the size criteria for those, you do need a variance to clean up those incidental disturbances. As you can imagine, 10 square feet isn't a lot when you're dealing with some debris and amount, because we're not talking about the quantity of material that was disturbed. You might have disturbed, you know, 1 linear foot of a pipe TSI, but it created a mess that covered 28 square feet. Well, you're small now, so you do need a variance for that. So it's the area that was impacted, not the quantity of the material that was impacted. The site-specific variance process does consist of a petition form, standard form number SH752. So everyone fills out that same petition form for each site-specific variance. There's a $350 petition fee that goes along with it. And then you can add on any supporting documentation if you want to put in the assessment report to give them a background, the abatement methods, more detail on abatement methods and relief requested. You submit that as well. So here's the petition form, SH752, the standard form that everyone would fill out. You know, the first item you identify is if it is a safety or health emergency. So if it is an emergency, it's going to go in the one pile that gets precedent. If it's not an emergency, it's going to go in the next file, the next pile that is going to come up behind all the emergencies on the review queue. Petitioner name and information. So this is going to be the owner, or it could be an agent of the owner if a state entity is like New York's SUCF, Construction Fund, New York State OGS, as an agency of the owner. That might be their information there. And then the petitioner's agent. So this is the designer that's selected to do the variance. They will have to have a current asbestos contractor license. Anybody that has a certification, whether it's designer, inspector, monitor, abatement contractor, they have to have a license to perform that work under, and it has to be current. So this identifies their license number and the name of that firm that holds that license. Bill and description, location, function, put all that information in. The second page, you would get to an order to comply or notice of violation. So if this variance is being submitted because there's a citation and the DOL has an order of compliance or notice of violation, they want to know that information here so they can look back at their files and see what the original intent was or the original cause of that order of comply was, so they can make sure the variance corresponds with what they need to get done. Then in a section to identify if there's a similar variance previously granted. So this will make it easier during the review process. If you've done something pretty similar or almost exactly the same, that'll cut down on the variance submission. If it's pretty much the same information you're putting in there, they can look at it and say, okay, yeah, everything matches up. We granted this previously. We're good to go and get it out a little quicker for you. Description of work area ACM. So this will identify those materials that were disturbed or the materials that are covered under the variance, and then what the quantity is that you're working with, where they're located. What Code Rule 56 sections are we trying to get relief from? We identify this in this section. Then what is the hardship? So if it's an incidental disturbance, the hardship is incidental disturbance greater than the minor. So we have to have a variance to do that. If it's something different, negative air ventilation type situation, or wanting to use certain piece of equipment that's not in line with Code Rule 56 requirements, that's the hardship you're going to identify there. What are the methods you're going to use? Put that section there. And then finally, the certification. So the asbestos designer does have to sign off on this and include their expiration dates for their certification to make sure they're still current, contractor license number. So everything there to make sure everything's legit and being done by a current certified designer. So that brings us to question number 3.
Back to you, Cheyenne. Oh, it looks like we're experiencing that issue where the poll is freezing up for some of us. Give me one moment. All right, you'll have to reshare your screen. There we go. We're perfect.
Okay. Getting back, had a little snafu with the webinar. I think it's been occurring here with GoToWebinar from time to time, but you should see the answer to question 3 there. Who reviews and approves the petitions for asbestos site-specific variances? And that answer is D, that engineering services unit for the DOL. All right, so that review and approval, generally 24 to 72 hours for emergency. They usually do turn those around fairly quickly. Obviously, you have an emergency situation. We want to get contractors out there as soon as possible to get taken care of. And a lot of times we'll see those come back, sometimes even the same day, but usually the next day we'll get a response on them. But, you might have a couple days out depending on their availability and what they have already in the queue. Now, when you're dealing with a non-emergency, at this time when we submit variances, we do get an email response from the DOL representatives that gives us a time frame as far as when we may expect those back, or what their time frame is currently for variances. I think a recent one we got was 3 weeks. I think that's been where they've been coming back with those responses. So generally 3 to 4 weeks it could take for a non-emergency. We do see a lot of times that they come in a little quicker. They'll tell, we'll get the response that it's about 3 weeks currently, and then we get in a week or two. So that's a good good situation. Usually they're at their estimated time frame or less. We don't see a lot where they tell us, it could take 3 weeks and it takes 10. So we get a realistic expectation from them as far as those non-emergencies are concerned. DOL can make changes in or additions. So when they send them back with an approval, you may see where they modified certain things in your request or process. So you would either generally have to agree with those modifications because that's what you have to follow, or if that's not agreeable, you would reach out to them and see if there's um, any ways to reconsider or redefine the process or procedures that you have planned. But there are certain things that you you really can't expect them to budge on. There's federal requirements. There's just things that aren't um, ideal for trying to ask for relief from. So if they do make a change, it's usually it's for the general good of public health and safety and all that. If you do want to make a change or modification after you get the approved variance, you would be able to submit an addendum and send that into the DOLs. But you do have to wait for that addendum to be approved, just like the original, in order for you to before you can implement those changes. Now, when we do a cleanup, incidental disturbance cleanup, or any abatement work, it is performed by a licensed abatement contractor. So like I said earlier, similar to an asbestos designer or an asbestos building inspector, they have to have a certification through the state, and they also have to have their own license for the firm to perform asbestos related work. And each of those licenses are a little different depending on the scope of work you perform, but it does have to be on file with the state that you're licensed and certified. Now, there are environmental consultants that can assist with these incidental disturbance assessments and the cleanups for those, and they're usually going to come in. They'll be do a design, do the design related activities for the variance submittal or work plan preparation and such. Obviously, when you're doing the abatement, there's requirements for air sampling during the cleanup and post cleanup. So you have a third party consultant doing that air sampling for you. And usually with a variance, for most variances, they're going to require, the DOL require full-time project monitoring because it is veering away from some of those conditions of Code Rule 56. It gives that extra set of eyes on a procedure that's specified differently than the regulations. And a third-party project monitor full-time will help to make sure everything stays consistent with those variance conditions. And then monitor the work practices for conformance with that site-specific variance. So that's always good to have that extra resource to make sure checks and balances sort of thing. If there's any questions or you need a variance addendum during that process, they can assist with that. Now, aside from site-specific variances, there are also what's called applicable variances. These were added, these were created after the Code Rule 56 regulation went into effect, but they're so common that rather than write site-specific variance after site-specific variance, they would wrap it into an applicable variance, and it's basically an add-on to your Code Rule 56 regulation. So anyone can use these without petition to New York State DOL, without notification to New York State DOL. Just use them as they're written in the applicable variance that they have out there. And again, they have to be done as written. You can't veer from them, because if you are, then you got to go in a site-specific variance petition. So there are 4 of them currently. AVA 1 is for controlled demolition on municipal projects, so demolition of a building that may be condemned or in disrepair, so you can get that demolished without having to go get a site-specific variance if it meets certain conditions. AVA 2 is negative air ventilation exhaust. Current regulations allow for 25 feet of exhaust. That was commonly, the closest avenue to the exterior, whether it be a window or a door. A lot of times that might be a greater than 25 feet. So there's AVA2 that will allow you up to 50 feet under certain conditions, and then even up to 100 feet with engineering control, more engineering controls in place. So gives you some relief there without having to go DOL every time. AVA3, non-fireable ACM floor cover and mastic removal using chemical methods along with low speed buffers. So there's a process for that anyone could use if they want. And then AVA4 is removal or cleanup of intact minor size non-fireable ACM floor tiles. So that's a applicable variance that's out there as well. Some other common applications of site-specific variances. So these are the hardships that you might have, that you might commonly see. Some instances where you can't shut down electrical service, so you got to keep some electrical service active. How do you go about doing that? Get a variance in place to do it. Size restriction, decontamination units. Code Rule 56 specifies a certain size decontamination unit dependent on the size of the work area, whether it's small, large, minor there. And sometimes you just don't have enough space outside of your work area to create that. So you'd have to submit a variance to reduce the size, allow for a reduction in the size of your decon unit. Building access egress limitations for fire code requirements. If you're gonna interfere with those in any manner, you should have a site-specific variance, how you're gonna go about addressing that and controlling issues there. Unable to use mechanical means of removal, exterior friable projects, to get some relief on containment systems for a friable type project on the outside of a building. You'll see a lot of some site-specific variances for that. Reduced barrier for exterior projects. So with an exterior project, if it's a non-friable removal, you're generally setting up barrier tape 25 foot around the area of work. You know, if you've got an adjacent building or you got something going on that's less than 25 feet, and you can't comply with that distance, you know, site-specific variance may help you around that. You might be able to do a reduced barrier and do an additional air sampling at that reduced barrier to make sure everything's good to go as you're doing your work. But that's a common one we see out there. All right, that'll bring us to question number 4.
And back to you.
All right, question 4. True or false, petition needs to be submitted to the DOL for use of an applicable variance, and that answer is false. Those are allowed for anyone to use as written. All right, so that gets me through everything I had for this webinar today. Again, I thank you for joining us this afternoon.